Thank you, Pastor. Let's see, did I have this on? There we go. Probably help if I have it on. Hajime mashite, Randy Brown desu. Dozo yoshiko onegai shimasu. It's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Randy Brown. Please be nice to me. So this is my wife Esther and two of our kids, Dean and Elijah. If you guys stand up and wave. And the other three around, we've got our only daughter Gwendolyn and two little ones, Scott and Chris. Got enough of them having to sit there and think, what are their names again? But we're from First Bible Baptist Church of Bakersfield, California, and partnered with Beacon International Baptist Mission to bring the gospel to the Japanese. We started deputation. Our 1 year anniversary was March 1st. So that would have just been last week. And 1 year in, we started off never having gotten a chance to visit Japan. But we had our survey trip in December. And so we're actually looking forward to 1 year in. We're about 55 to 60% through raising support, aiming to be making it back to Japan for February of next year. And in our survey trip, we kind of started off deputation, never having been there, just really loving the idea of the Japanese, stepping out on faith. Similar to how Nehemiah his heart was burdened for Jerusalem just because of the report of others. That's where we were when we started deputation. You know, we had heard all this about Japan. We'd read about Japan and studied as much about it as we could. But we really hadn't seen it. And so this past December, we had the opportunity. They finally opened up in October from COVID to actually get to go and see it in person and to visit the church we're going to be serving with. And so at this time, brother, if you're ready for that video, we'll have a video and I'll talk a little bit more about what we kind of saw and just what we experienced there. And as we saw the need firsthand and came to love the Japanese, not just the idea of them, but to love them as people.
Imagine that you have been raised in a society where you have to excel in every way. You have to be successful in academics, in business, and in every personal interaction. You have to be absolutely perfect. In a country obsessed with perfection, where does this leave those who fail? Failure in Japan leaves you with no path to redemption. You have shamed your parents, your ancestors, your nation, and your gods. You have no hope. Too many Japanese turn to historically accepted suicide. 3 Japanese commit suicide every hour. 25,000 people per year. Then there are many who aren't willing to commit suicide and choose the path of hikikomori. It is those who lock themselves in their bedrooms for 10, 20, or even 30 plus years. They have no hope, so they put pause on their life. This hopelessness doesn't just impact the minority. Loneliness and depression is a constant fact of life for the Japanese people. Families are breaking down. Fathers are absent. Some working so much, they see their family for less than an hour a week. 80% of Japanese wonder why they even exist. 10% wish they had never been born. Japan is a beautiful place filled with wonderful people. It's like the whited sepulchre. It's beautiful on the outside and dead on the inside. God has entrusted us with the gospel of Jesus Christ. He has called my wife Esther and I to go to the nation of Japan, to Okayama Prefecture, to plant a church there in His name. I would ask you to join us in prayer for the Japanese people. The Japanese youth of today are 6 times more likely than the older generations to identify as Christians. The door is open in a way that we haven't seen since the end of World War II. There are 125 million Japanese. They are the largest unreached people group in the developed world. Pray for laborers for the field. There is 1 missionary for every 56,000 Japanese. The harvest is plenteous. The laborers are few. Our plan is to be in Japan by the end of 2024. Pray that the gospel has free reign, that the people of Japan see their need for Jesus Christ, that his name would be glorified, that indigenous churches would be planted, and that the Japanese people would find hope in their Creator, Jesus Christ.
At the end of World War II, General Douglas MacArthur became the military governor of Japan, and he put out a call for 10,000 missionaries. He said out of all the needs for Japan, that's the number one need they have, is to hear about the gospel of Jesus Christ. At the time, there were many that went, but far too few. And I've heard stories about how when those men went, they would go into a town and they'd preach maybe in like the square, and hundreds of people would come to hear the gospel. You know, their society had been led to quite literally the brink of destruction. Unimaginable pain and suffering that really they brought on themselves as a nation. And they were open. Their faith in the emperor had been shattered. He had publicly declared, "I'm no longer a god." And they were open. America instead sent very few missionaries, but we did a great job getting American culture over there. If I were to walk around Tokyo right now dressed just like I am, I'd fit right in. If you were to go to a corner store, you'll find Coca-Cola. You know, you hear that's pretty much everywhere in the world. The first thing I saw when we were coming into Tokyo on our survey trip, we had gotten on the train at the airport, and we're riding the train into Tokyo proper, and there's a cross over a church, and then a giant Christmas tree right after it. And we saw all over Japan Christmas trees, and we heard Christmas carols in nearly every store we visited. Christmas is actually one of their number one holidays, and Easter is becoming more and more popular there. It made me think back to the book of Acts when Paul is visiting Athens and he sees the altar to the unknown God. They're quite literally celebrating the death, or the birth, and the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ every single year without having any real idea of who he is and what he did for them. They're in a society that tells them that your value is only what you contribute. Your pain on the inside, it doesn't matter. All we care about is that you conform on the outside to what it is to be Japanese and you put on a good face. They don't care about what's in the heart, good, bad, or ugly. And so the Japanese people are in a society that says you don't matter. And America has gotten them mercantilism. Our materialism is rampant there. You go to the stores and it's just busy, busy everywhere. On the surface, Japan looks like everything's put together, that everything's running well. And then you find out about places like the suicide forest, where people that have given up hope because they don't have an answer in their society. In that one place alone, anywhere from 200 to 400 people a year go and commit suicide. And you could actually type it into your phone, Google suicide forest, and it has a place you can hit directions to it. This is the only thing we have that's of any value to the Japanese. And we actually did get the opportunity on our survey trip to visit. One of the main reasons we went was to visit a church there, started by a national pastor, Kakegawa Bible Baptist Church in Shizuoka Prefecture, the pastor Enomoto Sensei. And just the Lord has opened up an amazing door. This is a church that was started by a national pastor reaching his own people. And we got to see the contrast when you see the people out in the world in Japan just going through the motions. And when you really look at them, you see lonely people that are seeking a connection. They're seeking more. They know they don't have the answers to life, but they don't know where to find it. And in the church, you see people that are still 100% Japanese because there's so much to admire about their work ethic and their industriousness. And just, you hear the stories about how clean Japan is. And we saw that too. But you look in their eyes in the church and you see people that are filled with joy. They have a family. They get there in the morning on Sunday morning. That's the one day that they have that they can all get together. And they don't want to leave. They get there first thing in the morning and they're there till 3 or 4 in the afternoon some days. And you see love and peace in contrast to loneliness and depression. And the Lord has opened the door. The church voted unanimously just 3 weeks ago to allow us to come and serve there for our first few years in Japan. This is a great opportunity, to learn firsthand from a pastor who has reached the Japanese. This is a church running between 50 and 100 in a country where a church is considered average size, about 10 to 15 people. And he's had a huge influence. And so, Lord willing, we'll be with him for about 3 to 4 years while we're in language school, and then spend an additional 1 to 2 years serving in the church full time and learning firsthand from him. And the Lord seems to be opening 2 possible directions for us. We have a particular burden for Okayama, which seeing that on our survey trip was kind of interesting for us. I'd always heard missionaries talk about how they go to a place and it feels dark. And I'd never really experienced that before we got to Okayama. In Kakigawa, the pastor there has a huge influence on the city. He's friends with the mayor. He knows most of the people in the government there. He knows on a first name basis. He has an influence. And it didn't feel like Okayama did. There was just I still don't have the right words for it. It's one of those things I think you just kind of have to experience. But we could definitely feel that the devil didn't want us there in Okayama. Just about everything bad that happened to us on our survey trip happened to us there. And we just could feel the oppression of the place. And it's funny how you can spend years studying, we spent years literally studying Japan and learning about Japan. And I've spent the last year plus learning as much as I could about Okayama. And it wasn't until we got there that we found out it is the number 2 place in Japan for the number of shrines and temples, second only to the cultural capital, Kyoto. It is very much a dark place. 700,000 people, one Baptist church preaching the gospel of 10 members. So there's a great need there. So we're praying about whether to plant a church there. Also, Enomoto Sensei has a heart for us to go to Hamamatsu, the town next to him, to plant a church. So we've got a roadmap for about the next 4 or 5 years, and just praying for the Lord's direction. And we're excited to bring them the one thing that we have that's of any value, and that's this right here. So at this time, we'll open it up for any questions. Does anyone have any questions about Japan? And that can be at me or it can be at my wife.
You mentioned you're working with a national pastor.
Yes, sir.
When you go to do the work, are you going to be working under him and then doing language school? Is that your full time as much as possible?
Yes.
Get the immersion and also get the language down. And then would your whole family be going in that direction as well? I didn't even mention that.
So currently what we're doing is we actually have an online tutor on a website called Italki. So our sensei, mine and Esther's, is in Osaka, Zusa sensei. So she's a national Japanese or native Japanese. And the kids have a native Japanese teacher, Doi sensei. She's actually moved to Spain, which actually works better for us to schedule them. So we're starting to get as much as we can now. And
so I noticed when you spoke, you opened with Japanese. It seems like you picked up some. That's why I was trying to.
Yeah, Nihongo ga少しわかります. I understand a little bit. And that really was a big help, even on just our survey trip. Being able to ask even just basic questions goes a long way to, we spent 2 weeks by ourselves.
Okay.
So that helped a lot. But when we get there, we've had from multiple different people. And Enomoto Sensei, our connection to him is through we have some friends up in Hokkaido, and they're serving with the missionary from Australia. And Enomoto Sensei is his best friend. So we heard it from him. We heard it from our friends, the Walters, and other sources that language. Probably the number one cause for missionaries to get discouraged and fail in Japan is they didn't get the language, either the husband or the wife. So quite often it's not uncommon, for the husband to learn Japanese and the wife just stays home with the kids and doesn't have that opportunity. And that's one of those areas where there's going to be people that Esther can reach that I never can. And on top of that, I mean, she's going to want to be able to talk to her neighbors and not feel cut off and just her by herself. So our plan is that me and Esther would be full-time in language school. We had the opportunity to go into the public schools there in Kakigawa, and we are going to be putting our kids in the regular Japanese schools. So we're told they're going to learn it in 3 to 4 months. And just with their tutor, they hear a word one time, it's like it's stuck. I hear it 20 times, I'm going, what was that word again?
Yes.
So the kids, we want them to be equipped to serve when they're 18. We want them to have the choice of where they're going to serve the Lord and be equipped to serve here in the States or to be equipped to serve there if the Lord leads that direction. But so we're going to have them in the school. And that also has implications on being connected to the community. Okay.
Is the Japanese writing different from Chinese?
So they have 3 different writing systems. So they have the kanji that was borrowed almost entirely from Chinese. And that's where you have a symbol is a word, which some of that just makes me want to bash my head against the wall. Because you'll have a big giant symbol that is literally 1 or 2 syllables long. The other 2 writing systems, which are entirely Japanese, they actually do have 2 different alphabets, but it's more of a syllable alphabet. So, like English, we have A, B, C, D, E, and all that, and you combine it. So, like, you would have D, A, and that would be 2 different letters. In Japanese, D, A would be 1 letter, or T, A would be another letter. So they have roughly 50 letters in each alphabet. One alphabet is for native Japanese words, and the other alphabet is for foreign words. So the best way to word that is, it'd be like if English had a completely separate alphabet for French and German words we borrowed. And so you can imagine how confusing that would get. But so we're still learning the second one, but so like I said, 3 different forms of writing they use there. 1 borrowed from China, and 2 of them native Japanese. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned in your online video that youth in Japan are now 6 times more likely to use the gospel in faith. What was the research behind that? And what's the being practice to also do that?
So if you want the deeper dive, you can talk to me later. So I'll just keep it to the brief answer. I also mentioned in the video, they call it the hikikomori, those people that are basically hiding in their bedroom, hermits. Back in the 90s, they have what they call the lost generation, where they had an economic collapse, and for most of 10 years, they stopped hiring people. And after that 10 years was up, they didn't go back and hire the people they passed over. Those people were basically marked as unhirable through nothing they did wrong. And so then they started off, because their system is to hire straight out of college. You have about 2 to 3 years to get hired before you're labeled as not hireable. And so you had, like I said, that group for 10 years, most of the 90s, they were marked as we don't want you. And so that kind of, through no fault of their own, the Japanese literally have, in a very real way, rejected that group of people, lowered their value. And so they're seeking. There's also economic reasons. The Japanese, they estimate within about 10 years that it will be 1 senior citizen being supported by 1 worker. And so they're kind of seeing how their way of life has brought them to a place in the young people's eyes where I've been forced into be a failure. I've been ostracized by my society through nothing I did. I did everything I was told to do. And then on top of that, they're putting a burden on them financially that they can't bear. And so there is a looking outwards. And there's actually a very great bitterness as well. That leads to the lower birth rate. That particularly was some surveys that were done over the last few years that age group would identify at 6% as Christian. Now, mind you, that's not just going to be Baptist. That's Catholic, Protestant, the cults, the JWs, Mormons, things like that. That's going to be everything that's Christian lumped together. But for one generation to the next, that's a pretty big jump.
What's the baseline? What's the baseline?
Less than 1%.
Less than 1%?
Yep.
And it's up to 6 in that generation. Okay.
Up to 6 in that generation. So there's a much more of an openness there. And really there's a lot of signs that too few missionaries have gone, but those that have gone have worked really hard. They planted and sowed. They just haven't seen the increase. I just heard that 40+% of households have a Bible in them. So, I mean, those who have gone before have done a great job of getting this seeded out. And so it just seems to be that the Lord seems to be giving a time possibly for a great harvest coming. And I believe there's one coming. At the very least, God's giving them another opportunity, and their hearts are seeming to be more tender than they have in the past. Okay.
I've heard it's very expensive in Japan. Is that the case?
The area we're going to, we were kind of surprised, relatively affordable. You know, I'm from Southern California, so I don't know how the living expenses are around here, so probably comparable.
Mostly comparable, yeah.
Yeah. Kakigawa, like regular foodstuffs was actually fairly cheap. They're behind us on the inflation curve, probably about a year and a half behind on the raised prices. But while we were there, they told us, hey, a lot of stores have signs that next month we're going up 20% or 30%. So that was going to hit because a lot of the prices we saw were actually really cheap. The housing in Kakigawa, we're looking at about a 1,200 square foot house, give or take, for about $700 to $1,000 a month, which is fairly affordable. That same footage in Tokyo, you're looking at like $3,000 to $4,000. And some of the bigger cities will be probably between, Kakigawa is more of a suburb. So the bigger cities, the downtown areas would be more between Tokyo and the suburbs in pricing. So probably about $1,500 to $2,000. But if you can live in Southern California, or you could live here in the DC area, you could live in Japan, no problem.
These bedroom people receive any support?
What's that?
The people who are stuck in the bedroom on pause, do they receive any support?
So what ends up happening is their parents basically are enabling that because it's a shame to them to have a child that's doing that. So the parents will continue to feed them, you know, will financially support them. And I mean, a lot of them are actually using the internet to, you know, there's some that are computer programmers and things like that now. But for the most part, they're getting their support from their parents.
If their parents die, then they're without any support.
Yeah. Well, the problem's relatively new enough that hasn't been a single issue. But to be honest, if the parents stopped feeding them, they would come out. They'd be forced to. But it's shameful to the parents, and so they will do everything that they can not to address it. They don't want to talk. You know, they're not going to talk to their neighbors about it. They're going to pretend everything's fine, and so they'll just keep supporting them. But there are some groups, they call it a big sister, where so they will privately come in. The parents pay for them to actually sit outside the door and try to coax them out. But outside of that, public acknowledgement is very, very rare on the issue. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
While you're on deputation, are you homeschooling the children?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what curriculum are you using?
Was it Landmark?
Landmark.
Could
So,
you repeat that?
Landmark. So what we found, because we looked at, they were in a Christian school doing Abeka, and what we found is Abeka has just the quality is great, but they have so much extra seat work that just didn't really, it would have just been a nightmare. And we did the first 3 months of deputation, they were finishing up their Abeka that they had been in the Christian school at home, and that was a nightmare. Landmark we found is just as good a quality, but a lot less of the extras. So they get it in a very concise format that we can do in the road.
And you only have so much space in the van.
Yeah,
That's
already taken up.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's part of it.
Yeah.
Did you didn't introduce your whole family? Did you introduce them? Okay, I was in Southport, sorry.
Oh yeah, no, we did. So there's
Yeah.
Dean and Elijah,
Sorry,
Gwen's.
I was at the South Board. I apologize.
Oh, no problem.
I get it.
All right. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
The people that have put themselves in their rooms, what's the plan to reach them? Would it be to reach the parents first and hope that the parents would then in turn?
I have some ideas. I'm not sure how effective it will be, how receptive they'll be. I kind of mentioned the Big Sister program, and that's something the parents have to pay for. There's a book I've read it's called The Japanese Mind. It was recommended to me by some missionaries there that had given it to their church. So given it to actual Japanese people, say, hey, read this, tell me what you think about it. And their response was every missionary should read this before they come to Japan. And one of the chapters was dealing with the hikikomori. And they actually talk about, at the end of it, they have some study questions. And they have seen that the hikikomori do better when they're taken out of Japan. So it's like if you can get them out from under the Japanese culture. So I mean, it's like they're right there thinking through something's wrong with Japanese culture that's creating this particular problem. And they recognize you take that person out of Japanese culture, it does better, but they don't really want to address it. So we've got the idea of maybe doing like I need to think of a better name for it, but like Gaijin brother, and Gaijin is like foreigner, where I would for free take the time as a ministry to do what the Big Sisters are doing and just see about the opportunity to sit out there, outside their door even, and just talk to them and try to witness to them and just show them love. Because really the main issue is they've been shown that you don't matter. They've been rejected, did everything right, and their other option was suicide. So just showing them Christ's love and just that seems to be the most effective way to get them out. And even like I said, even the Big Sisters, they're doing more for those people than even the government is. Which I don't know if I said the number, but there's the number one expert on those says there's 10 million people in their bedrooms at any given, which is just astronomical. In a country of 124 million, there's upwards of 10 million. There's only about 3 million Christians, or 1.5 to 3 million.
I was just curious if the area you're going to is earthquake prone.
That's Japan. That's all of Japan. Now the positive side, so Kakigawa, we will be relatively close to the ocean. I think there are some mountains in between, so my mom is probably happy about that because that whole coast gets tsunamis whenever there's an earthquake. Okayama, with the geography, you've got the main island kind of comes down and goes over, and you've got another main island here and a strait that goes between them. That entire strait has never had a tsunami hit it because it's all going to hit that southern island. That's where Okayama is never, as far as they can go back 400 or 500 years that they've got records, that area has never been hit by a tsunami, but plenty of earthquakes. Okay. Yes, ma'am. What's that?
Who supports him? His children, the elderly that are in your home?
What's the support system for the elderly?
Really, they have a social security system like we do. In a lot of ways, and we ran into this with some elderly people when we were there. The kids move away from home and basically leave their parents to their own devices. Historically, that's not been the case in Japan. There was more of a connection there, but they've gotten to where it's all work, 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 work. Family is second. And that's not to say there's not still those connections, but it's much reduced over what it had been in the past. And it's not uncommon for an old person never, and I know it happens here too, where, the kids might come home for the holiday and that's it. In fact, there's a very big problem with elderly dying in their homes and no one finding out for weeks or months. Yeah.
Have missionaries gone to suicide forest?
There are some that do. that's an area where I've been giving that some prayer. On our survey trip, I wanted to see if we'd have an opportunity to go there. And the senior missionary said, don't now. I've got a heart, because literally you could go there, and like if you spent a week, and that's something I am prayerfully seeking as an opportunity, spending a week there, you would have the chance every single day to find someone that's going to commit suicide. Because that's just that 200 to 400, that's just the numbers of those who succeed. And so what they'll do is they'll go and they'll actually pop up a tent, and they'll also take a string and run out into the forest, because it's very twisted. There's like, it really almost, from just the descriptions I've heard, sounds very demonic. There's no sound. There's not a lot of animals in there. And so you go in and it's very quiet. The trees grow in very twisted ways, and very easy for people to get lost. It's only about a mile deep and about 13 miles long. And yet people will go in and get lost. So they'll tie a string off and go in there. So, I mean, just from what I've read, there would be great opportunity to possibly reach some people. Because most of them don't just go there and kill themselves immediately. They'll stay for like 2 or 3 days, and you'll see them camping out and stuff like that. So there's another missionary. He's just finishing up deputation. We've already talked. He's going to be on the other side of Mount Fuji, and we're going to be about an hour from there on the opposite direction from him. And we've talked about potentially meeting up there like maybe once a year or so, and just seeing what we can. Probably going to see things that will stick with me for my life, but you know, if I can reach one person that way, you know, it'll be worth it. So, and we're praying about the opportunity to go there and reach those that way.
The Bible, is it translated into Japanese?
It is. The primarily accepted version is called the Shinkyaku. It's where Japanese is as far as translations is like English was before we had the King James. So there's no good King James equivalent. There's a group working on one called the Lifeline, but they just finished their New Testament translation. And they're at least 30 or 40 years away from having a good Old Testament translation. And being the first release of their New Testament, it still needs a lot of work. So I'd say probably another 10 to 15 years before the New Testament they have is where it needs to be. But it's something I'm following very carefully. But the accepted general one is the Shinkyaku. It's a full translation. It just mixes in a little bit of the critical text, which I'm not a fan of. But the Lord's using it. And that's why we're following the Lifeline so closely.
I have one last question. Would you ever hire a translator?
What context? Like for, because
when you're working over there, you haven't quite got the language yet.
to be honest, I would probably always pass what I have past a national. They can tell that if something's written by a foreigner, just the way we would write it is going to be different. Most foreigners, they learn the proper speech first and then the common speech second. That's just the way they teach it. And so they can always tell when a foreigner's written something. So I would probably pass it through Japanese. Lord willing, he'll give church members that could do that. I haven't ever thought about hiring someone, but if my heart is to do everything to the best of my ability. And they're very particular, so that I hadn't thought about hiring someone if I need to, but that probably would be something I'd do if it's needed. Okay. Yes,
I
ma'am.
might have missed it, but what percentage of your cost do you have right now?
We're between 55 and 60. So, and I did actually, I mentioned in the video we were aiming for the end of 24. God has had us on track since we started deputation to finish a year early. And so we are on track, Lord willing, still for finishing up and being in Japan this time next year instead of at the end of 24. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, I have about 5 minutes left. So who can tell me the shortest verse in the Bible?
Jesus wept. I don't remember the reference.
John 11:35. And yeah, I'm bad about references too. I had to say, what is the reference again? Let's turn over to John 11:35. So this is one of those verses, I think that, if you've spent any time in junior church, it comes up a lot because it's kind of silly. Hey, kids, what's the shortest verse in the Bible? Jesus wept. And yet I'm fully convinced that those two words are some of the most powerful in all the Scripture because they reveal Jesus' heart for each and every one of us. Because if we look in context, we see in the first part, and like I said, I've only got 5 minutes, but we see in the first part that Mary and Martha there in chapter 11, verse 1 through down through verse 7. Mary and Martha, their brother's sick, and so they send a request to Jesus because they knew who was going to bring healing. They're doing what we would do, 911. They're in an emergency. Their brother, they know he's sick to death. And so they send a request and expecting, if you dial 911, what's the expectation? Come now. Could you imagine you dial 911 and 2 or 3 days later or 4 days later, you get the knock on the door. Okay, we're here. Where's the emergency? That was over 2 days ago. So they're sending to Jesus, and yet we see that he intentionally delays. You see there in verse 4, it says, when Jesus heard that, he said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. It says, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And we had heard, therefore, that he was sick. He abode 2 days still in the same place where he was. Then after that saith he to his disciples, let us go into Judea again. And he goes on, and in verse 14, he speaks unto them plainly, because he tells them, hey, he's sleeping. And they think he's literally just, Lazarus is taking a nap, is what the disciples think. But he's like, no, Lazarus is dead there in verse 14. And I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent ye may believe. Nevertheless, let us go unto him. And going on down, we see in between verses 17 and 31, we see that Mary and Martha both come and they confront Jesus about his delay because Lazarus had been buried. And we see he'd been buried 4 days late there in verse 17. Then when Jesus came, he found that he had lain in the grave 4 days already. And they come and they confront him and they say, Lord, if you had been here, our brother wouldn't be dead. To be honest, they're kind of limiting Jesus because how many times did he heal someone when he was miles away? But the truth is that Jesus could have healed him. And if you've ever lost someone, the hardest time is those first few days, that first week, when the wound is fresh. And yet Jesus allows Mary and Martha to go through that. And we see here, he doesn't condemn them for how they're feeling. He doesn't even condemn them for their reaction. And he gives them comforting words. He says in verse 25 to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? And she gives a reply that this is the basis of everything we do here. This is the basis of Christianity. She saith unto him, Yea, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world. Everything is about him. And she's saying, I believe that. And then Mary comes and she makes the same accusation against Jesus. And he sees her weeping there in verse 33. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came with her, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled, and said, Where have ye laid him? They said unto him, Lord, come and see. And then we have those words, Jesus wept. Quite often, we can get the feeling that Jesus isn't near. That when we're going through struggles, that Jesus, what does he care? I don't know if you've ever heard the song, when he's 4 days late, he's still on time. And yet here we see Jesus, he knowingly allowed them to go through great pain, and yet he still wept with them. And that is the heart Jesus has for each and every individual. And I would continue on, but I'm going to close with this. This heart that Jesus has for Lazarus and for Mary and Martha, that's the same heart he has for me. That's the same heart he has for you. And that's the same heart he has for every person. All those Japanese people that think there's no one that cares, Jesus cares. And he's seeking them. And he's coming, and we see, and he goes on, and he raises Lazarus. Jesus' goal is to take the pain, and let's be honest, he allowed the pain. But he allowed the pain so that he could bring life. We could take that all the way back to Adam and Eve. He could have stopped sin right there and stopped all the history of pain that we've had as a human race. And yet Jesus Christ was looking forward to you and to me. And so we need to keep in mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about some other things later, that Jesus Christ is very personal. No matter what we're going through, he's right there with us. And he's seeking us to bring us life, and he's seeking others to bring them life. So you're all dismissed.